In the last video, I talked about the definition of politics, and then I provided some examples of it and expanded on that. In this video, I want to talk about non-democratic forms of government, and then we're going to return to the discussion of democracies, but with we'll dig in a little bit deeper on the topic of democracies. Because again, remember, the overall theme of this particular set of lecture videos is assessing democracy. But I think it's important to know what non-democratic forms of government are like, and then we have a better idea of what we're comparing democracy to. Keep in mind, too, that I'm going to be returning back to my definition of politics over and over and over again, not just in this lecture, but in future lectures as well. So one form of a non-democratic form of government is a totalitarian government. So here's the definition of a totalitarian government. A totalitarian government is a system of rule in which the government recognizes no formal limits on its power, and it eliminates all other social institutions that challenge its authority. So it recognizes no limitations on its power, and any other social institutions that try and exist within that society, it just eliminates them. The poster child for totalitarian governments in 2021 is North Korea. They are a totalitarian system in the finest tradition of totalitarian systems. Another way of looking at that definition, totalitarian government definition, is in the struggle over the allocation of benefits and privileges. A totalitarian government controls all of it. It controls the entire struggle. For example, in North Korea, if you have stuff, it's because the government, the party, Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, allowed you to have it. If you run afoul of them and piss them off in some way, you'll lose that stuff. They control 100% the struggle over the allocation of benefits and privileges. Now, by the way, here's an example. See where it says controls it all? If you look on your lecture notes that were downloaded from Canvas, that isn't on there. It's up for you to write out this additional information, to put North Korea where it says example and the idea that they control it all, and to elaborate on that. In terms of authoritarian governments, an authoritarian government is a system of rule in which the government recognizes no formal limits, but is restrained by the power of other social institutions. Whereas in a totalitarian system, all other social institutions have been eliminated. What distinguishes authoritarian and totalitarian systems is the presence of social institutions within the country. A good example of this would be China. I don't know how much you know about the history of China, but if you were to go back to the time of Mao Zedong, China would have qualified as a totalitarian system. But over the course of their history, they've become more modernized. And one of the decisions they decided to make was to allow capitalist enterprises to come into China and set up there. And so as a result, in the struggle over the allocation of benefits and privileges, it's not only China that doles out the good stuff that people want. These businesses do as well. So in terms of jobs, right, these businesses dole them out. Sometimes these businesses provide housing. They decide how much they're going to pay, and that determines how much other stuff you have. The government isn't controlling it all. Now you could say, well, Phil, the government could just tell them all to leave. Yeah, they could, but that would create a tremendous amount of hardship. As soon as they allowed these capitalist enterprises in there, these capitalist enterprises started becoming involved in the allocation of benefits and privileges. It would be really hard for China to say, okay, everybody out. Because then all the Chinese citizens would look to them to provide the benefits and privileges. And at this point, they're not really in a position to do that. So that's what makes China an authoritarian regime, because there are other social institutions that are involved in the struggle over the allocation of benefits and privileges. They're involved in distributing those benefits and privileges. So the way that you could describe authoritarian governments would be that in the struggle over the allocation of benefits and privileges, in an authoritarian system, the government controls most of it, but not all of it. And then finally, we come to democracy. And we're going to elaborate on this a lot more, but just as a starting point, democracy is a system of government in which political authority is vested in the people. And when I talk about political authority, I'm referring to the right to rule, the right to be in charge of who our leaders are and who our policies are. That in theory at least, and we'll talk about the extent to which this is true, the right to rule is vested in the people. That we have the right to, in theory, to determine our fate. So, what's an example of a democracy? Well, the United States is an example of a democracy. Sweden is an example of a democracy. Canada is an example of a democracy. There are all kinds of examples of democracy, and some of them have varying degrees of sort of freedom, but we're not going to get into that right now. So the way you can talk about this and think about this is that in the struggle over the allocation of benefits and privileges, in a democracy, the government controls some of it, some of the struggle, but not all of it, right? Not all of it by any means, because you have businesses, you have churches, synagogues, mosques that are all trying to providing people the things that they need, the benefits and privileges that people in a society want, right? So totalitarian system, in the struggle over the allocation of benefits and privileges, the government controls everything. In an authoritarian system, the government controls most, but not all of it. And then in a democracy, the government controls some of it. Now, there are actually different types of democracies. And we're just going to talk about this briefly just because it's important for you to know. And I'm just going to refer to two different kinds: direct democracy and representative democracy. Okay, in a direct democracy, the way it works is that the citizens themselves are the ones who vote directly on the laws and policies. Now, generally speaking, this happens like at a small scale. Like, so for example, in New England, they're famous for having what are called town hall meetings, where there might be a small community and they want to decide on whether or not to put a street light on Main Street. In a direct democracy, what would happen is all the citizens in the town would get together, like at the town hall, and they would discuss and they would debate whether or not to put a street light on Main Street. And after they do their discussion, they vote. And if more people vote in favor of a street light, then there's a street light installed. If more people vote against it, there's no street light involved. Right? That's direct democracy, because the citizens are actually the decision makers in that kind of setup. In a representative democracy, what happens is citizens select representatives during elections, and they're responsible for passing the laws and policies. And so you can imagine another small town that has a city council. And in that city council, when there's a debate over whether or not to put a street light on Main Street, citizens might come in and talk to their representatives and tell them what they think, whether there should be one or whether there shouldn't be one. But ultimately, the decision is going to be made by the representatives. They're going to wind up voting on whether there should be a street light on Main Street or there shouldn't be. So in direct democracy, the people are the decision makers. In a representative democracy, representatives elected by the people are the decision makers. Now, in the next video, what we're going to talk about the conditions that are necessary to maintain a democratic form of government.